We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
Hell yeah! Hell yeah!
Hey, Truth Seekers, welcome back for another very exciting edition of the Oh Hell Yeah Show. Today, we're going to be talking about the Invincible family. You can see it right here on my screen. There's a brand new book under the same name. It says, Why the Global Campaign to Crush Motherhood and Fatherhood Can't Win. Now, if you believe it's a big conspiracy theory and no one's out to get the family, I get it. You're not concerned about it. And I got to say for myself, I have a family. I'm from a family. I'm familiar with families. I love my family. I'm aware that there are forces trying to bring them down. I wasn't sure how much I was actually going to learn from this book. I was skeptical. But after having dove into it, I think you're going to be really impressed how well researched the author is and really how much there is going on behind the scenes. So I hope you enjoy it. I want to welcome the author, Kimberly Ells. Kimberly, how's it going?
Great. Thanks so much for having me on.
I feel a little inadequate because I haven't finished reading the book yet. And now that I'm a couple chapters in, I'm ashamed. I feel like I haven't done my work yet. It's fantastic. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to write it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm a mom, first of all. I have 5 children. I'm also a policy advisor for Family Watch International. And how I got into family advocacy work was a few years ago, 2013, I believe it was. I ran across a document online that was celebrating and advocating for children's sexual rights. And I was somewhat taken aback by that. I didn't know that in the mainstream that those things were being promoted, and that was disturbing to me. And so I got looking into it and found some like-minded people quite quickly at Family Watch International who had already been aware of and fighting this agenda for quite some time at the international level. And so I climbed on board at that point because I decided if that was real, what I was reading, that it wasn't going to happen without me fighting it. And it turns out that document was published by International Planned Parenthood Federation, and one of their main, we hear about them in relation to abortion, of course, all the time, but another very troubling part of what they do is promote the children's sexual rights agenda.
Okay, so I'm going to miss some stuff here, which is why I encourage everyone to go out and put this book on your buy now list on Amazon and check it out. I'm going to kind of give you my evolution. I was expecting to bring you on and talk about the UN because I look at these people as kind of a Bill Gates, Microsoft freak show, too much power, not enough wisdom, really, really odd conspiracy theorist ideas about how the world should run. And so you open up the book and what does it do? It goes back to the history of which I love, Engels and Marx and the people that absorbed their ideas and tried to implement them in society. And so you go back 100 years to 1919 and you talk about how the Union of Soviet Socialists, the Republic, tried to create a national fund so that when women who were not supposed to be married but have collective families, weren't married to anyone, weren't attached to anyone, weren't tethered, as you say, that their children would be raised by this national fund until they were 18 years of age. And I thought, holy cow, it's like the Americans on FX. And it's like the Scientology special. They literally thought that everybody should be part of the greater collective, and they tried to implement it. And then you talked about how Mao Zedong loved these ideas and also implemented them in his country, and how we should really think about those things when we talk about socialism, but we don't, because it's just this happy way of everybody all being equal and egalitarian. So can we start with that? Can we talk about the evolution of these ideas? And also don't forget to talk about unseating women, because I thought one of your best points was that the things these men tried to do by force to women are now doing voluntarily to themselves. It's fascinating.
It really is fascinating. And as you said, digging back to the roots of socialism, socialism is enjoying, unfortunately now, a great resurgence, at least on some levels, because of the doctrine it teaches of equality, which is a good doctrine on some levels, a valid doctrine on some levels. But if you walk it back, like you said, and look at the history of socialism, modern socialism anyway, with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, you see that they were forthrightly anti-family, and that they stated clearly that their objective was to abolish the family. There's a reason for that. It's because there's inherent power that resides within the family, within families. And that's rooted in the fact that the family is a private organization. The mother and the father inherently have claim over and private responsibility for their children. They create life, and then they're responsible for it, and they can do what they want to a certain degree with their children. Of course, the state intervenes if there's cases of severe abuse, but by and large, parents love their kids, and they have the right and opportunity to nurture them and teach them, and that gives parents power. It gives them a lot of power. And so if the state wants to be having power and making sure that everything is distributed equally according to what they think is equality and fairness and promoting the ideals that they want embraced, then they have to take that power from the family. They have to crush the family, so to speak, so that they can use the power that the family has. And I think my hope is that when people see socialism from that point of view for what it is a family crushing institution, that they will recoil from that and realize it's not just about equality, which it never has been able to deliver on a large scale. It's about crushing the family. So that's I think key to understanding why we have to be wary of socialistic interventions.
You've seen some people on social media that supported Black Lives Matter originally that have now looked back and said, I forget the guy's name on Fox Sports 1, who said, you know what, I just read about how much they hate the family, and I think, wait a minute, I had a family. That was a pretty good upbringing. Why is that something that's on their hit list of things to get rid of? And as I read your book, and actually I have the Mao Zedong quote here, where he said, in order to build a great socialist society, it is of the utmost importance to arouse the broad masses of women to join and in productive activity. Genuine equality between the sexes can only be realized in the process of the socialist transformation of society as a whole. It sounds like a hodgepodge, but the word for me is productive activity. Why is he encouraging women to be more productive than they otherwise were?
You'll notice in that quote, as well as in Marx and Engels' writings, they imply that the work of raising families, raising children, is socially unproductive, which at its root is completely untrue. It's probably the most productive, socially productive activity that there is. But you see, they want to convince families, women especially, mothers, that there is no inherent social value in just raising kids for free, because you're not earning any money. You're not contributing to the gross domestic product, so to speak. But that just completely undercuts and ignores the fact that there will be no people to grow up and work productively in society if they're not raised properly, if they're not nurtured by people who love them when they're little, and that produces the best outcomes. And so even though motherhood or fatherhood doesn't produce money right now, it produces people, which is the greatest, resource and greatest capital, so to speak, that we have. And so, but if you convince people, especially women, that raising children is unproductive, then what happens? It opens the door for other forces to raise children, which is exactly what they want.
So without belaboring this point too much, because I encourage people to go read it for themselves, pretty fascinating how these visions aligned back then and they're being manifested now. You also quote some of the early first and second wave feminists. Some of them I wasn't that familiar with, like Firestone, I hadn't read too much about. She was a real piece of work. So in terms of the ideas they were advocating and the specific policy advancements, help us understand how these two things overlap.
Right. So there's three forces that I explore in the book, three forces that are trying to destroy the family: socialism, feminism, and then sexual radicalism. So for feminism, it's largely rooted in socialistic ideas. And as you mentioned, Shulamith Firestone was all about that. And one of the main things, she wanted complete equality, meaning that there would be no parents with unequal power over children. So if parents were in charge of a family, she saw that as an unequal power structure that needed to be destroyed. And so if you follow that line of reasoning, then you have to give children, in her opinion, give children full legal rights and also sexual rights. And so which is very concerning to most people on both sides of the political aisle. So what she wanted to see was a society of what she called complete equality, where children were treated exactly like adults. The problem is they're not exactly like adults, and they need love and training, and they need guidance. And so even if she said that society should dole out equal portions of money to every person, even children and then adults, and then magically that would produce equality. Well, of course it wouldn't, because children wouldn't know how to use and invest their money as wisely as older people. And older people who didn't have the best interests of children at heart would take advantage of children and their money. And so then you'd be left with huge inequalities as well as the exploitation of children. And so it's just a bad plan all around. And unfortunately, it's not just one lone feminist from the 70s we're talking about. These ideas have come into the mainstream and are coming more into the mainstream as far as feminism goes.
Who are some of the other, just briefly mention without talking too much about the context of their ideas, who are some of the other primary feminists that people can go and Google and read more about their ideas that influence this discussion?
The primary one that I discussed in the book is Sophie Lewis, who has a book out just last year, Full Surrogacy Now, and the subtitle is Feminism Against Family.
Pretty on the nose, right? Anybody else?
Yeah. Those are the main ones. I mean, there's a great network of feminist influences. There's the Novo Foundation, which is, maybe we can talk about this more in a minute, but funding some of the education initiatives at work in our school systems in America.
Yeah, so we officially opted out. We came out as pro-choicers for school this year, so big pride parade for us, yay, empowerment. And that's definitely something I want to touch on, because I think that they've made critical errors with the lockdown, one of which is people who can leave the public school system are finally finding the nudge, the reason to do it, and we're included in that group. So talk to us about, actually, let me go back to the introduction of the book is funny in terms of timing. There's this gentleman I follow on Twitter named Rob Henderson, and he's a Cambridge student in philosophy, and he just posts a lot of psychology tidbits from the books that he reads while he's pursuing his PhD. Are you familiar with the name, by the way? Have you seen him on Twitter? No,
I haven't seen him.
He's up and coming, but the thing that really got him on the radar is his idea of luxury beliefs. And I think all of us have seen this in some way, but he kind of contextualized it as that for a long time, elite status was conferred upon those with luxury goods. Now that luxury goods are so ubiquitous and everybody has access to them, even poor people, they had to change the game. And now it's luxury beliefs, where you signal to others that you're in elite status by the things that you say and believe and your egalitarian ideals that you supposedly have. And he was, there was a thread yesterday I just saw before we talked about doing this interview, and it was talking about how part of the issue is they have a special colloquial speech, a language, so to say, where they signal each other with certain terms and words. And if you're a conspiracy theorist, you're thinking Pizzagate. If you watch the Epstein special, which I just did, you know that there are certain ways they do this. If you saw Wayfair, I read your book, and the first chapter opens up with, what is career interruption? Well, it's a UN term. What is therapeutic interruption of pregnancy? It's a UN term. What is the informal economy? What are national care systems for children of the world? These are all things they're discussing at the UN that people like me, normies, might have no freaking clue what they're talking about. And that's what I really want to get into, is what is going on at the UN, and also what do those terms mean? What are they trying to accomplish?
Well, the main thing that's just big picture of what's going on at the UN is that the socialists, feminists, and sexual radicals of the world have for a very long time been gathering around the UN table and forming relationships and alliances and influencing what goes on there. And they've been very successful in doing that, and doing it in such a way that it appears to be doing good things. It's draped in language that's very appealing. But what you'll find in my book, even as you read, is that these forces are at work to destroy the family in the name of global equality, in the name of fairness, in the name of, helping children. But those things are not going to deliver on their promises, and they're going to fail in a big way. But in the meantime, a lot of damage is being done. And one of the main things that is being pushed, along with just openly socialist and radical feminist ideas that are promoted on the global level through United Nations agencies, is this notion of children's sexual rights. And it appears that from our research and many years of experience, that UNESCO and UNICEF and UNFPA and the World Health Organization have all adopted this belief that the children's rights agenda is right for children, and they are actively pursuing it. A document that that UNESCO published in 2018 is draped with language encouraging children to claim their sexual rights and for governments to protect children's sexual rights. And so as we see, it's very concerning, because just last week, the UN Secretary General made a public statement, and he said that a new model for global governance is on the way. And he said it would be based on redistributing wealth and power. And so what I know and what you'll know after reading my book is along with that is going to be a lot of sexual ideology that will be brought. They're planning to bring forth. What I want to do is stop that. But that's the agenda, because if you corrupt sex, then you corrupt the family. If you convince young people that it's their human right to just have sex just because, then that's a huge win for family destruction.
I can already see Prague's going, oh, of course sex is all right. So let's talk a little bit more about what's actually going on at the UN. And before we do, I want to mention the tweet that I brought up, the thread from Henderson. One of them in the quote was that egalitarianism is a social badge that covers up radical self-interest. It's something you wear as a guise because who can argue with equality and egalitarianism, and so you just don't question what's really going on. And that's what I want to talk about at the UN. There's a couple points here that I wrote down for bullets. What else is brewing at the World Health Organization? The UN's child sex scandals and infiltration in systems of the world. I mean, for me, when I look at people at the UN, the freak show, I look at what's happening at Portland and Seattle right now. Naked aggression, tearing down the town, lighting things on fire, arguing with cops, and they're just being a little more civilized, going through the proper infrastructure and wearing suits and ties. Like, am I off base here? What are they really up to? Let's give us some examples.
Well, you asked specifically what is going on at the World Health Organization. And we all know that World Health Organization has been in the news lately because of the COVID-19 crisis and their handling of it. I do want to say outright, there are good things happening at the United Nations.
Sure.
There are good people trying to do good things, but there also is a great deal of corruption, and it seems to hinge on sex. And so we're going to get to that. The World Health Organization, in addition to apparently, it appears, having some very strong communist ties, they openly advocate for the decriminalization of prostitution, the decriminalization of injection drugs, of course, the widespread acceptance and legalization of abortion. They push a gender theory for kids. The World Health Organization, one of the documents they signed on to, suggests that by age 5, children should be taught about gender incongruence. And then, as I've alluded to already, they are pushing a children's sexual rights agenda. And some people listening may think that, well, of course sexual rights are a good thing. And on one level they can be. But when you read the examples in my book for children, most people, certainly most parents, and no matter what side of this political aisle you're on, you find it troubling.
Well, let's talk about why that is. There's a section in the center of the book, I forget what chapter, where you repeat the oft-mentioned statistics about what happens when a father is not present in the home. And essentially that gives you the worst possible hand you can be dealt. I got in an argument with some family members at a get-together recently where we were talking about privilege and Black Lives Matter, and me pointing out that there's no more privileged place than college in terms of I'm going to go down a rabbit hole here, but I said if you're looking at the most privilege you can possibly have, you need to look at two things. One is two-parent privilege, and the second is that people who push these egalitarian ideas don't actually live them. I mean, college graduates, but far and away at the Ivy League, have parents that are married, who have intact nuclear families, even though they don't push those ideologies. So, now I forgot what the question was going to be. Talk about child sexual rights. Oh, in the book you mentioned, the one thing I don't hear very much is that not having a father in the home has a disproportionate effect in some ways, especially sexually, on the daughters as opposed to the sons. And I live this. My father wasn't in the home growing up, and I thought I got off just fine. My sister, on the other hand, has had some of the things happen to her that you describe in the book. When you talk about seeking love in the wrong places, being seeking out abusive partners, being subject to different types of psychological damage, and also the sexualization of children leads to these things in much higher degrees and proportions. Kind of talk about that a little bit.
Right. We were hearing from many sources today about the importance of fathers. And if there's going to be fathers, there needs to be marriage, right? Women and men need to commit to each other in marriage and whenever possible, stay married. Of course, there are going to be exceptions to that rule, and those things can be dealt with. But by and large, fathers prove to be a protective factor. They're so often presented as barbarians, and while in some cases that may be true, most fathers are good, decent guys, and they serve as protectors and providers for their children, which they should, and they excel at that role most often. There's data to show that, as you said, particularly young women tend to suffer when they don't have a present father. Again, it doesn't mean that they're doomed, but it just means that in larger numbers, they become pregnant as teens more frequently. They have difficult relationships with power figures, especially men, and it goes on and on. Alcoholism and drug use and so forth. And so if we're talking about what's best for young girls or young boys, it's fathers and of course mothers. And it works best when those two people are working together.
Yeah, I found it. It was in The Goodness of Men is the chapter, and it was, imprisonment, abuse and drugs, eating disorders, raping, and sexual abuse. And then you go on to talk about how weddings are actually for men, and the tethering process combines them all as a family. Without getting any further into that specifically, talk to us about the comprehensive sexual education programs. I mentioned us pulling out of public school. I gave it a lot more thought after I interviewed Andrew Pollack, whose daughter Meadow was killed in Florida. And I said, if you had advice for any parent, what would it be? He goes, don't mess with it. Just get them out. Like if you knew what was going on in public school every single day, you would say, I don't want to be anywhere near this. Thomas Sowell said if Martians came down after 30 years of public education, they would just assume the idea was to destroy education, that it was to obliterate it. What are comprehensive sexual education programs that we should be aware of, and what do we do about them?
This is a major focus for me and for Family Watch International. And so we're not against sex ed per se, but what we are against is this radical form of sex ed that has emerged called comprehensive sexuality education, which you can read all about in the book. I detail 3 whole programs about it. And it's often presented as this wonderful thing that's going to reduce sexual disease and reduce teen pregnancy and empower the teens and so forth. And so it sounds very good, but when you get into the nitty gritty, what you see is promotion of sex and teaching kids essentially how to engage in sex acts and teaching them how to consent to sex. There's some really disturbing things. I hope I've handled it tactfully in the book, but most parents would never teach kids about sex in that way. And I contend that parents are the best gatekeepers of their children's sexual knowledge. And so if parents are the first to talk to their kids about sex, then kids see the parents as the authorities. Whereas if parents never address it until the school does, then oftentimes the child will see the school as the authority. And the school may or may not be teaching what you want your child to know. And so there's, again, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but there's some very alarming, very destructive things that are woven into the comprehensive sexuality.
Yeah, I think people are here for the detail, and I think the term they use in the pornography industry is it's tastefully done. Can you do it tastefully, as to not offend?
Well, one of the main things that I find most troubling, and that most people do, is that many of these programs push sexual self-stimulation on children and encourage children to participate in self-stimulation and describe what that looks like. And all throughout, there's different age groups, and in every age group, starting at the very earliest ages, children are encouraged to sexually stimulate themselves, which is problematic because it keys children into sex way too early, according to what most parents would believe. And so that it starts from there, and it unfortunately just gets worse. And of course, if you're going to have what they call inclusive sexual education, to include people of all sexual orientations, there's a great deal of sexual activities that you have to cover. And so children are often exposed to things that they never would have considered had they not been introduced to them at school. Of course, children can access sexual information from many sources on the internet and so forth, but we shouldn't be planting it in their minds at school. We should be teaching them about the realities of sex and, commitment and the benefits of marriage. And, there's tons of data out there showing that teens that remain sexually inactive during their teen years have so many benefits. They experience so many benefits in their lives. So we should be encouraging teens down that route. Well, they're still free to make their own choices, but we should be encouraging them down the most healthy and productive routes.
Yeah, it is funny that I was talking to someone online the other day about in terms of Christianity, that the science of happiness eventually catches up with the doctrine. Because the doctrines aren't explained, they're what's the word I used? You evolve to understand them through experience. And one of them was that this guy was 23 years old, and he said, I just learned for the first time today there's stats on the amount of pre-marriage sexual partners that especially a post-adolescent girl has, the less successful her marriage will be. The more likely she'll have multiple marriages. I'm like, do they tell kids that during these comprehensive sexual programs, or they just do what pushers do? They just give them the drugs. They say, take them, don't worry about it, and come back to me when you need more. And eventually, by the time the child is 25 years old and they're damaged goods, they can't have regular relationships anymore. Sounds hateful and bigoted to say it, but I agree with you. That's a process that should be explained by the parents and not schools, not public curriculums. So there are 23 chapters in the book, of which I've got a few to go, but I got a couple questions for you about your own writing, your own research. Is there anything that you wrote about in here that through your research that surprised you, that you learned that you weren't expecting, that you wrote about?
Lots of things. One thing I want to point out specifically is that International Planned Parenthood Federation has pushed in many areas of the world to lower the age of sexual consent, so that what would be considered rape, the age would be different. And in tandem with that, the World Health Organization, as I mentioned, is all on board with decriminalizing prostitution. So I realized in the course of study that, and it doesn't take a genius to realize that if you're going to lower the age of sexual consent, and then you're also going to decriminalize prostitution, what are you setting the stage for? You're setting the stage for decriminalized teenage prostitution or child prostitution. This cannot be a good idea on any level. And so we're currently witnessing this great outrage, as we should, about child exploitation and sex trafficking. And we should be all out to fight that. What I'm saying is, we need to find some energy to address the children's sexual rights agenda, because it is priming children, in my opinion, to be sexually exploited. If you're telling kids, hey, it's your right to have sex, in some sense, some children may take that it may make them more vulnerable to the advances of others who don't have their best interest in mind. And what we want to avoid at all costs is decriminalizing child prostitution. There's very few people in the world that would want to see that happen. Fortunately, a few of them are at the United Nations.
We say that. We always say people would listen to reason and they would see things clearly. But one thing that's come to my mind during COVID is they're talking about the amount of sexual trafficking arrests, investigations, victims that are coming up. The numbers are mind-boggling. I read one yesterday, and speaking of tastefully done, I'll just say it. They were talking about this 2-year-old that was rescued that had been, I think, sexually assaulted or raped. 2 years old. 26 different men in a 48-hour period. And I thought, there aren't enough bullets in the world, apparently, to go and solve this problem. It's mind-boggling. And you look at the ideas these people have and the things it would do to little kids, and you say, it would be game over. I mean, I was going to use an example from Epstein where they talk about decriminalizing and not being able to prosecute certain crimes in certain places. And then you wonder why they travel these exotic destinations with all their friends so they can traffic kids. What do we do? What do normal people do about this in terms of awareness and helping to solve the problem? I know the answer is a family protects people from these things. A loving mother and father is the only shield a lot of these kids would ever have. But they're not as privileged as we are to live in a country that was built on these values. What do we do to help them? What do we do to help our own?
Thank you. I want to point out one thing before I get to the answer.
Sure.
I mentioned before that there seems to be trouble brewing at the United Nations in relation to sex. And the one thing I've said so far is these child sexual rights agenda programs that are being pushed. The other thing is that there is a torrent of sexual abuse pouring out of the United Nations, just like the little girl you just mentioned, just absolutely tragic. Well, I expose in the book, and I interviewed men who worked for the United Nations, and they told me example after example of child exploitation being committed by UN peacekeeping troops around the world and others. And we have got to pay attention to this problem. So not only do we have the UN pushing child sexual rights officially, but then they also have this torrent of sexual abuse pouring out of their agencies and their peacekeeping troops. And these two things juxtaposed are just a huge problem, And so your question is, how do we fight any of this? Sometimes it seems too big. And I do have, at the end of the book, I have 2 whole pages of things actions you can take to help with these things, both large and small. And I think the first thing we need to do is to not get overwhelmed, because if we try single-handedly to take on the child sex trafficking of the world, then, that may be difficult. But we can join forces, of course, with with Tim Ballard's organization and support that. And there are other organizations working out there. The National Center on sexual exploitation is another great one we can support. But first and foremost, and we can't see this as simplistic, we need to teach our children, starting with our children, what we want them to know about sex, gender, marriage, and the family. They need to hear these things from us regularly, age appropriately. And these things need to be woven into our conversations. And that is something we all can do and we all must do. Because children tend to listen to their parents, especially when they're little. The teenage years may be a little bit different, but they're still listening. And so we need to take that seriously. The other thing we need to do, in my opinion, is become aware of the Children's Sexual Rights Campaign and fight it wherever we can. And the thing is, you can fight it locally. You don't have to go to the United Nations. If you discover that comprehensive sexuality education is in your school or coming to your school, you can fight that. And I'll point to a couple of resources. You can go to stopcse.org. That stands for Stop Comprehensive Sexuality Education.org. And the first thing that's going to pop up there is a 10-minute video that everybody should watch called The War on Children, which explains in brief the children's sexual rights agenda and how it's being pushed. So once you understand that, then you can see what you're fighting, and then you can get involved locally. And if you Google Protect Child Health Coalition, that's a place where you can connect with people who are near you in fighting these things, and you can win. We see successes all the time through that coalition of people who band together. They go to school board meetings, they go to legislative sessions, and they make a difference. And they keep inappropriate material out of the schools or where it's in, get it out. And it's a tough battle, but it can be won, and it's one we have to fight.
That was Protect Child Health Coalition? That's what it was? Okay.
Yes, along with stopcse.org.
Sorry, I interrupted you. What was the last thing you were going to say?
Well, the other thing, to help you in teaching your family, buy great books and read them. Like fiction, nonfiction, like buy great books and read them in your family that teach the stuff you want your kids to know, that reflect the principles. Because if your kids are in public school, and I understand that many people will choose to keep their kids in public school, you need to make sure that your kids are learning from you what you want them to know. So study the history of socialism. There's a chapter in my book about China and the grave offenses against women that have been committed in the name of equality and protecting the globe, radical environmentalism and so forth. That it's just chilling. People need to read these stories because it's just motivating. We can't let those things happen in our country. We have to stand with people who are being abused in these ways across the world and find ways to help. So we have to be informed first before we can act. And I feel like once you're informed, then you kind of find a niche of where you can make a difference. And everybody can. You just have to go looking.
That was terrific. I probably should end right there, but I have another question. Before I do, you mentioned Tim Ballard. My wife follows Tim Ballard, and the other day she's like, you know what I think? Because we were actually reading your book and with our beds set up last night and going over all the quotes, and she goes, Tim Ballard is that guy that like every mom kind of secretly wants to, the wishes was their husband. And I said, on my podcast, I always talk about projecting. I think you're doing that right now. You can just say it out loud. Like you're looking at me and you're seeing Tim. Yeah, maybe a little bit right now because he's a stud. He's like Superman and he's gorgeous. I'll admit that. But he's doing great work. And I have a question about your book. It's got 23 chapters. I just read The Artificial Mother, which was terrific. My next one I'm going to read is Commercializing Parenthood. I can't read books in order anymore. I'm broken. But if people only had one chapter to read, which one would it be and why? They had to pick one.
Oh, gosh, that is tough. I hate to skip to the end, but maybe the last one, because when they read that one, they'll want to read the rest.
Okay. All right. Which are you talking about the What Can You Do or Stand?
No, The Stand.
All right.
Stand.
Well, give us a teaser. If they're going to read the rest, then tell us why. What's so great about it?
Well, it ties into the title of my book, The Invincible Family, because as concerning as all these things are that we're talking about, and as alarming as they are, guess what? They're not going to win, because the family is the thing that always rises. A man and a woman who produce life together and love and nurture their child, that's the thing that has always existed, regardless of what other governments have come and gone. And it's the thing that will always exist unless we abandon it. And so it's built into our human anatomy that's the way it happens. And you don't need any laws or any other outside forces to bring about a family. And when a life arises from your very body, like it does in our human anatomy, there's something extremely compelling about that people want to care for what they have created. They love it in almost every case. And therefore, it creates a kind of a cradle of love for where every life can and should begin. And so it's very tough to crush that. It's very tough to crush the bond between mother and child or father and child, because it's real and it's physical. And so as concerning as things are, we have a great reason to hope, both for our individual families and for the family at large.
Well said. Well said. That's my other take on the scripture that says, greater love hath no man, is that you can give no more love to anyone than your family. That's where you learn to sanctify and consecrate your efforts for those that you care about. And from there, you can stretch it out to others. Kimberly, the book so far is wonderful. I want to encourage everyone to go out and put it in your Amazon cart right away. Pick it up. You know what? Buy more than one copy. Buy someone for someone you love. And there's some really good stats, some great arguments, and overall, so far, it's been terrific. So thank you for joining me. Thank you all for those who are listening. Please share it with someone else who would like to brush up on their knowledge of what's coming for the family. And I wish you a lot of luck and success on your book tour. Keep at it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Say, if you love your kids,
if you love the kids,
don't let the freak shows get them.
don't let the freak shows get them.
Please subscribe and share.
Please subscribe and share.
Good enough. Good enough. Good job. Good job. Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Who are you guys? What are you doing? Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.